Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of Music 104, Rock Music History and Appreciation. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you had a good week last week. I know that it is ridiculously hot, which is pretty typical for this time of year. I was up in Canada last week and in Calgary, and I've never been to Calgary, and so I just sort of assumed it's Canada, it's going to be cold. Yeah, that's not the case. At least not this time of year. Apparently in the winter, it'll get into the negatives up there, but it was in the high 80s and not this hot though. So I hope you're doing well and hanging in. This week, we're going to be covering chapters 3 and 4. So we're going to still be leading into rock and roll, and then we're going to get into rock and roll. And I'm going to set those up. My goal is to make it so that this isn't a 20-minute video, but we'll see how that goes. I do have a little bit of show and tell, but before I get into the nuts and bolts of this, I finished grading your assignments from week 1, and there's a couple of things that I want to put out there just so that you all know. One, for your reflection observations, you are asked in the instructions to copy and paste the prompt at the top of your assignment. Please do that. It is not for me, it is for you. It is to help keep you on task, okay? So that if you're like not sure you're answering it, you're gonna see it right there. And whether you wanna write it in something else and then, copy and paste the whole thing in, that's fine. Whatever, however you wanna do it is good. But make sure that you copy and paste that in there. If you're doing this on your phone, figure out how to do that. If you don't know already, it's not that hard. Hopefully you're doing it on a computer, it's even easier. But whatever, make sure that you put that on there. I want you to get the best grade possible. And so I want you to put that there. Again, that's why I ask you to do it in the instructions. It is important that you follow the instructions and that you do the things that you need to do. The other thing is that there were a number of people that did not complete the assignments or didn't do it very well because they were putting it in at the very last minute. I mean, literally like 11:58, they hit submit and they were just sort of throwing up anything just to get something in. You'll lose a lot of points by doing that. If you look on the rubric, you can see that if you have an assignment that's not complete, you're not going to get a good grade on that. So plan ahead. Those of you, that's why part of why I have you do those introductory modules on learning about how to manage these classes, because time management is a big one for a lot of people. And I'll tell you right now, top thing, trait in terms of successful people is good time management. Also, discussions. Some people were really kind of light on it, whatever. You're going to see variable grades. You do the assignment, you don't get all the grades. You got to earn all those grades. But part of the assignment for the discussions is to reply to 2 other prompts, at least, with a thoughtful, meaningful reply. Some of you did 1, some of you did none. You won't get all the points if you don't do that, okay? So I think that's that for housekeeping. Again, a reminder, if you're watching this, hopefully it's Monday. I know that it's Labor Day today, and yes, it's a holiday, at least today when I say that, when it's going live. And you may not be looking at this till Tuesday, whatever, that's fine. You can certainly manage this week and take the holiday and not have to worry about it. But do not delay. Don't get yourself locked out, because it has happened, okay? So I think that's it for the housekeeping stuff. So let's just talk a little bit about what you're going to learn. You're going to learn here in week 3, in week 3, you're going to learn about chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 is gospel and country roots for rock and roll. So if you think back, we learned about jazz. You learned, before that was ragtime. You learned a bit about folk. You learned about the blues. You learned about the beginnings of the blues with country blues and Delta blues and classic blues. And then we learned about urban blues as the populations were moving around in the country. A lot stimulated by the wars, certainly after World War II. And so you had a lot of folks moving into the big cities, and particularly you had a lot of the Black communities that were moving into these bigger cities, that were living in their, in their neighborhoods, some by choice of where they chose to live, some not by choice. Because, I have this sort of like love-hate thing with the term systemic racism. It's thankfully not near what it was, because we have a lot of laws in place that don't allow for that. However, Back in the day, there was, they used to do redlining when they would sell houses, and they would decide, like, okay, this is where, the Mexican folks are going to live. And this is where the Asian folks are going to live. And this is where the black folks are going to live. Really not cool. And now that's against the law. You can't do that. And real estate agents, and I know this because I have a license, even though I'm not a practicing agent, you can get a lot of trouble if you try to steer people into or out of certain neighborhoods. And that's the way it should be, right? But people do that. It happens. And that's the reality. Back then it happened. There wasn't as many laws on the books. And so it was just really a sleazy, mean thing to do. That said, sometimes, people want to live amongst the folks that they are comfortable with. And so I understand that as well. So you had people moving, and then out of that, along with the advances in technology, I mentioned some of that last week, with microphones, with recordings, certainly, with electric guitars. Thank you, Gibson. Thank you, Fender. Amplifiers, PA systems, microphones, tape. Technology moved things around. And by the time you get it into these communities in the cities, this is where we see the start of urban blues, which is more electric guitars and small bands and amplified blues harp, which you know what that is now, right? Because I told you last week. Maybe I'll pop up a question here about blues harp right now. So we'll see if I did it, if I remembered. Okay, so technology, I think I talked a little bit about radio and how all radio that we're dealing with is all AM radio, and that's still the case as in terms of where we were at. We want to talk about recordings, and then last week I told you I'd have a little show and tell. So I'm going to have a little show and tell. So I'm going to be moving off to this side here. I'm mostly prepared. Sometimes in the past I forget to pull this stuff out. So I want to talk a little bit about recorded music, because obviously that's a huge factor in this class. So recorded music actually started in the late 1800s, and there was two ways of doing it, on either wax cylinders or wax discs. And if any of you have seen a gramophone, or you've seen a Grammy Award, that's a gramophone that's on there. So it's kind of like the record player with the big cone that comes off the top of it. The thing about those old gramophones is they were both recording and playback devices. So you could record somebody by having them sing or speak into the cone, and then it would write onto the wax cylinder or disc. And then you could also play it back, and that would be its speaker. Things evolved and changed. And then eventually we get to closer to records as we know them. Now, what I'm going to show you first here may look like a vinyl, which is the term that a lot of you young kids use. I know there's a person or two that in this class that's older, that's not what we called them. We called them records. Or LPs, and I'll talk about why we called them that. But I want to start off by showing you when we moved out of the wax technology, they got to what we call 78s. And this is a 78. It's broken. You can see that's busted, and I'll explain why. Now, at first look, you may go, oh, that's a vinyl. Nope. 78s were actually made out of shellac, which comes from beetles, the bug, not the band. Beetles are the bug. Beatles are the band. So these were made out of shellac, and they were called 78s. And the reason is that they revolved at 78 revolutions per minute. Okay, RPM, right? Revolutions per minute. That's a 78. And so as a result, you could maybe only get one or two songs per side. They revolved pretty fast. Sound quality wasn't great. And so you typically get a song or maybe two on each side, and that was it, okay? Because they were made out of shellac, they were very, very fragile. So this is actually, like for this class, I kind of take good care of this, because I have some others too, but because I've had others that just shatter. If this falls, it just shatters into pieces because of what it was made. Now, in World War II, and between the wars and World War II, shellac started to become a more rare material, and that's how eventually we get to records being made out of a plastic type material called vinyl. That's right. So when y'all are talking about vinyls, you're talking about the material that it's made out of. That's not what it is. So if you were, let's say you had an aluminum can of Coke, it'd be like calling those aluminums. right? So if you see us old people acting weird about it, that's why. So that's the same deal. Okay, so I'm going to show you in 1948. There was a couple of competing technologies that came out, but in 1948, which is a couple years after World War II, we know that World War II ended in 1945, is when the material, the records changed and 45s came out. Now, if you know that a 78 is called a 78 because it revolves at 78 revolutions per minute, then you know why a 45 is called a 45, because it's 45 revolutions per minute. Technology is a little bit better. Materials a little more durable, better sound quality, but also it's a a man-made material, and so that's how we get with the vinyl records. 45s typically only had one song per side as well. This is actually the very first 45 that I bought myself when I was a little kid. I bought this in the 70s, and it has it's the song "Rock Around the Clock" by Bill Haley and the Comets. Now, this song came out in 1954. You're going to learn about it this week in chapter 4. The reason that I discovered this song as a little kid was through the TV show Happy Days. So if any of you know the song or the TV show Happy Days, when that first came out, which was really took place in the 50s, it didn't have its own theme song, and so what they used was Rock Around the Clock, and so I discovered it. I fell in love with the song, as did so many people back in the 50s, and all the way on up through, and I went and I bought this record, and I still have it. It's in terrible condition. It'd be all scratchy and all that sort of stuff. That's the downside to this. But yeah, so there you go. So that's a 45, Rock Around the Clock. I have a few others that I own. This one cracks me up because I was 10 when I bought this. I'll just share this with you because it's funny. This is ZZ Top's Tush. I'm sure you all know what a tush is. I don't know that I did when I was 10, but I loved this song. It's got a great guitar part. It's an amazing song. So those are 45s. And then, and this is really what y'all are thinking about when you're talking about vinyls. And we're talking about what we call an LP or a record album. Now, a couple things to understand. Okay, we're going to probably hit 20 minutes easy. Just bear with it. We don't always have the show and tell. Back in the day, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even into the early 60s, most bands, when they went in, and artists, when they went into a studio to record a song, they would typically, if they were going to say they were going to make a record, it was always going to be a 45. They weren't going in to make an album. This is how songs were released. You had an A side and a B side. The goal was that you thought what you thought would be the hit would be the A side, and then you'd have another song on the other side. Sometimes you would actually have an opportunity where the B side became bigger than the A side. But that's the idea. So when people say, "Oh, I'm going in to record a record," that's what they were recording, not this. And so they would put it out on the radio and they would get it out there. And if it would be a hit, then it'd be a hit. And people would go to the record stores and they'd buy their 45s and they'd go home and they'd put it on their record players because those were things that started to come out. And you're also going to learn this week, by the way, about the importance of the transistor radio and why that was so revolutionary. I'll talk about it in a tiny bit. But so what would happen is, let's say that if an artist had enough hit records, then they would end up putting out an LP, which is short for long playing record. Now, an LP would typically have about 10 songs on it. You'd roughly have 5 on a side. I think this one has 5 and 6. Correct. This is actually Sun Records. You're going to learn about Sun Records. This is Jerry Lee Lewis on Sun Records. And so in the early days, when we would talk about a record album, it would be a collection of songs. Don't think of a record album like it would become later, where it's a sort of unified whole. It did change a little bit for certain things. So in other words, like Frank Sinatra would typically not often release 45s. He could release LPs, things like that. Certainly classical music would be different. but in the rock and pop world, that's how it was. So if an artist had, 8 or 10 successful records, then they would put them together on this long playing record. Long playing record, because it revolves at 33 1/3 RPM, and it was longer. It was about 20 minutes per side, thereabouts. So even when I was growing up, CDs didn't exist yet, all that sort of stuff. There were cassettes, but for LPs, you had to, it was down on the side. You had to pick up, flip it over, listen to the other stuff. And so, yeah, so then the collection would come together, and they would put this together, and the reason that they would call it a record album may seem a little weird unless I use this analogy, which is think about photographs, right? So you take a picture, you take a photo, whether it's on your, on a camera or whether it's on your phone, whatever. And then let's say that you have a collection of photographs that are unified by some sort of idea. You put them together in an album, right? So that would be a photo album. This is a record album. It's a collection of songs. Now, in the later 60s, thanks to the Beach Boys and the Beatles, the role of how an LP would work is different, okay? So there's the little technology breakdown for you on how those work, and that stays the same. The cassettes come out in the 70s. 8 tracks before that had terrible audio quality. We don't get, cassettes in the 70s, and we don't get CDs until the 80s. And then of course, MP3s, and then Napster, and then streaming, which is where we are now. So technology always plays a big role in driving that. So when back in the day, most people listened to the radio. That's how they heard the music that they were gonna, that they would hear. And then if they heard songs they really, really liked, they would go down to the record store and they would buy it, like I did with Rock Around the Clock. Okay, so moving on, chapter 3. You're going to learn about the role of what we call sacred music. So there are, we've talked about different types of music, but there is sacred music and secular music, and sometimes they overlap. But sacred music means religious music. In this country, it often has, sort of Christian church ties to it. So you'll learn about spirituals and gospel. But any sacred music, every culture has sacred music, depending on what their religion is and all of that. So you're going to learn about the roles that spirituals and gospel played in moving us towards rock and roll, because they would go on to influence a style known as doo-wop, which you're going to learn about as well. And doo-wop was basically a secular style, meaning non-religious, but in the styles of singing, the styles of harmonizing, a lot of that came from the church. And a lot of the important rhythm and blues singers in the 50s and the 60s, a lot of them came out of the church. So you're going to learn about that. And then mostly that's still following that black thread. Think about most of what we've learned about, we're really primarily talking about black music, but you're also going to learn about the role of country music and how country music also is important to give us the foundation that becomes rock and roll. And so you're going to learn a little bit about the history of country music, of hillbilly music. You're going to learn about, the stuff from the 20s and the 30s, and you're going to learn about Western swing a bit and honky tonk and how those get us to where we're at. And then chapter 4 is actually the chapter on rock and roll. So it says early rock and roll, but it's really rock and roll. And rock and roll itself was a pretty short amount of time, like 1954 to 1959, and roughly. And rock and roll is really just a renaming of rhythm and blues. So rhythm and blues that you've already learned about, you learned about jump blues, in some of the early, you learned about Bo Diddley and some of those folks back in those days. What happened is that rhythm and blues was really widely understood to be a black type of music. And there were a lot of people that didn't approve of that. They didn't necessarily, I think I talked about how concerts were segregated and all of that, so that you would have, black audiences or white audiences, or if you had them sometimes at the same time, you would have one group in the balcony, the other downstairs. Or sometimes they would have ropes that would divide them. And so rhythm and blues was really known as a black style of music and a black term. To give you a kind of quasi-modern example, when rap first came out, which the term rap is a music style, the term hip hop was not music. The term hip hop was really about the culture, and we'll get to that down the line. But everybody understood, they kind of knew what rap was, and rap was really a black style of music until the Beastie Boys came along, and the Beastie Boys really changed the game significantly for that. But then also on top of that, you started to have the gangster rap artists like NWA and people, and it really gave rap a negative connotation. And that's really when the term hip hop started to be used in terms of music, and it was a much more innocuous term. So you could have rap artists and you could have hip hop artists, and hip hop, that's cute, that's like a bunny, and so it sort of took the weight out of that. Well, this is what happened, was that basically you had rhythm and blues, and a lot of young kids, especially a lot of young white kids, were hearing it on the radio. And the reason they were able to hear it on the radio is that the transistor radio was battery powered radio that you could listen to on your own. It was think of like an iPod, right? Or now with our phones and everything. And so prior to the transistor radio, a lot of houses had radios, but there was one radio in the house. And so everybody had to listen to it, like back in the day when there was one TV in the house. We actually only have one TV in my house right now, but everybody's got devices, so it doesn't really matter. So, if you think about the movie Christmas Story, and they would go down and listen to the radio, right? And that was it. It was the family thing that everyone had to decide what they were going to listen to. The transistor radio allowed a level of independence for teenage kids. And so they could hear music on black radio, because there was white radio and there was black radio and there was pop radio. And they could hear a lot of songs by artists like Fats Domino, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and they fell in love with it. And it was rhythm and blues. That's what it was. Well, along came a DJ, who I am total, Alan Freed, who came along, and he basically took the term rock and roll. He didn't invent it. Some people will say, well, he invented the term rock and roll. Rock and roll had been around. It had a meaning, particularly in the black communities. It's a slang term that could mean a number of things, including sex. So if you think about rockin' and rollin', right, you get the idea. And so that's what it came from. And so what Alan Freed did was he basically took this term rock and roll, and he basically just renamed or rebranded, is what we'd call it today, rhythm and blues. And then he was able to play these artists, and they started to become more popular. And then what happens is along comes Elvis Presley. And so you're going to learn about Elvis Presley. And when we talk about this class, we talk about the game changers. I talked about this in the past. There are no bigger game changers in terms of popular music in the 20th century, or popular music period, than Elvis Presley, and then later the Beatles and Bob Dylan. And Elvis Presley absolutely changed the game, because he was a white guy who sounded black. I don't know if any of you have seen the Elvis movie that recently came out. I haven't seen it, so I can't speak to it. I have a hard time. I'm not a big Baz Luhrmann fan anyways, but a lot of these, they sort of tell the stories in certain different ways. But I'll catch it at some point, because that's my duty. But Elvis came along, and thankfully there was a guy by the name of Sam Phillips who started a record label named Sun Records. Now, we already learned about Chess Records last week, and now you're going to learn about Sun Records. And he started Sun Records, and he was primarily recording black artists. He was down in the South, in Mississippi. And Elvis comes in and basically wants to make a recording for his mom for her birthday. And back then you could go to recording studios and say, hey, I just want to record a couple of songs, and they'd put you in a booth and you'd record them, and you'd pay your little bit of money, and you'd come out with one record. That one record, by the way, still exists. In fact, Jack White, if you know who Jack White is from the White Stripes and his solo work, but he actually owns that, bought it on auction. Not too long ago, I don't think, within the last year or two. Anyways, so Elvis comes in, and Sam Phillips, it all clicks, and he realizes this is the guy I've been looking for. It's a white guy, good looking guy, great voice, but he sounds black. Now, that may not sound that way to us, and that may even sound weird that we are saying that, but that's the way that it was back then in the early 50s. So Elvis comes on the scene, and basically what happens is he breaks the doors wide open. At the same time, 1954, a movie, or 55. So Rock Around the Clock comes out in 54. A movie called Blackboard Jungle comes out in 55. Creates that whole rock and roll look. You see all these tough kids in their jeans, t-shirts, leather jackets, all these little, hoodlums and stuff. Elvis comes along. Elvis really hits big in 56 with Ed Sullivan Show, and Milton Berle show, and here's another thing. And then Elvis becomes a big movie star. So the thing is that television and movies play a big role in the success of Elvis, but in the Beatles and in other artists that we're going to see as well. So you're going to learn about Elvis, and then you're going to learn about how he blew these doors wide open. And as a result, you had people like Carl Perkins, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, the Everly Brothers, these artists that maybe never would have made it through because they were playing this style of music that wasn't really socially acceptable. And all of a sudden, Elvis just blows everything wide open. So he opens the doors for a ton of people to be able to come through. But then also on top of that, he later would have an impact on folks like, that would be in the Stones and the Beatles and all of those, because they heard Elvis and their lives changed because of that. So I know that was a long one. You'll go through these materials. Please take the time and go through them. I've mentioned this in announcements. I can see the amount of time that you put in. Make sure that you're spending time with the book. If you don't have the book, get the book. You're going to need it. You're going to see your quizzes. They're asking you stuff about that. The questions I'm going to ask you are about are very much informed by that. Okay? I will really try to pare these down more moving on, but we had to get through a lot of the technology stuff. It'll be simpler going forward, but that was stuff that you had to know. All right, that's it for me. Have a great week. Keep cool, and I'll see you soon.